Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Our mission here is pretty simple. We take a stack of sources, some really brilliant research, biographical material, and we boil it all down into the essential knowledge you need to be, well, truly informed.
And today we are undertaking a deep dive into the life and work of Samuel Berkeley Beckett. Born in 1906, this Irish playwright, novelist, poet, the list goes on. He didn't just write masterpieces.
Wow.
He completely redefined the very boundaries of what theater and literature could even be in the modern era.
When most people think of Beckett, I think they probably picture the Tramps, right? The waiting, all that silence. And his works are really defined by this unique and, often devastating voice. It's bleak for sure, but it's also laced with this impersonal, tragicomic absurdity and a kind of literary nonsense that just somehow feels intensely real.
And what's absolutely critical to understand about Beckett is that this bleakness wasn't an accident. It was a highly intentional artistic choice, one that he forged through, decades of intellectual searching, psychological trauma, and even wartime heroism.
Right. And he was awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1969 for writing that, and I'm quoting the committee here, in new forms for the novel and drama, in the destitution of modern man acquires its elevation.
And that's it. That's the core paradox.
That's the contradiction we're wrestling with today, isn't it? He spent his entire life writing about failure and destitution, yet he achieved this monumental, lasting success.
Exactly.
So our stack of sources today helps us unpack that journey. We're going from his surprisingly aristocratic Dublin origins through his clandestine work in the French Resistance and right up to this pivotal artistic revelation that just steered him completely away from high modernism and toward the profound minimalism he really mastered.
And we'll explore that lasting global legacy of the man best known, of course, for Waiting for Godot, a man whose brilliance was, truly bilingual. He was writing and often translating his own essential works in both English and French.
Okay, let's unpack this and maybe start at the beginning, with his roots. Because if you're picturing the childhood of a man who would later write about tramps and people living in ash cans.
You'd be very surprised.
Yeah, you would be. Samuel Beckett was born in the Dublin suburb of Foxrock on April 13, 1906. This was not a background of poverty.
Oh, far from it. His father, William Frank Beckett, was a very successful quantity surveyor. And he had Huguenot ancestry, which is, a detail that adds this interesting layer of nonconformity to the family history, even generations later.
And his mother?
His mother, Maria Jones Rowe, was a nurse.
That Anglican Church of Ireland upbringing feels like essential context, especially when you look at the philosophical landscape of his later writing.
Absolutely.
He moved toward an agnostic perspective. But that foundation of seeking, of waiting for something, it just informs the existential void we see in his plays. It's the waiting for a presence that is, I guess, culturally ingrained but spiritually dismissed.
And the physical environment really grounds his early sensibility. The family home, Couldrina, it was a large house built by his father in 1903. It had these expansive gardens, a tennis court.
Wow.
And when he started writing, those anchors, the Leopardstown Racecourse, the nearby railway stations, the actual physical topography of the Dublin countryside, they weren't just memories for him.
They became the landscapes of his work.
They became the sparse, recurring landscapes of his imaginative universe.
It's so interesting how those precise, detailed geographical markers from his youth contrast so sharply with the abstract, almost placeless quality of his most famous plays. They often just seem to take place on some dusty, undefined road.
Exactly. The abstraction is built on a foundation of absolute reality. And speaking of foundations, academically and athletically, the young Beckett was, profoundly gifted.
He attended the prestigious Portora Royal School, which, funnily enough, is an institution that also graduated Oscar Wilde. Then he moved on to Trinity College Dublin from 1923 to 1927, where he excelled, studying modern literature and Romance languages, and ultimately graduated with a BA.
He was definitely academically driven, but this is where that contradiction starts. This intense intellectual focus was matched by a really surprising physical prowess. The sources all confirm that Beckett was a natural, highly skilled athlete.
He excelled at cricket. We're talking left-handed batsman and a left-arm medium-pace bowler. But how serious was this pursuit? Was it just a hobby?
Oh, no. It was serious enough to enter the official record books. He played 2 first-class games against Northamptonshire while playing for Dublin University.
No way.
Yes. And this detail confirms that Samuel Beckett is the only Nobel literature laureate to have played first-class cricket, ensuring his name remains enshrined in the Wisden Cricketer's Almanac.
That is just fantastic.
Yeah.
The man who wrote plays about immobile characters stuck in sand or in urns is himself recorded in the most rigorous statistical record of sport in history.
It's perfect.
It really speaks to the energy and the sheer physical presence he must have possessed before he channeled it all into the, austere internal world of his writing.
And after Trinity, that intellectual journey just accelerated.
Yeah.
From 1928 to 1930, he served as a lecteur d'anglais at the École Normale Supérieure in Paris, and this move was completely transformative.
Because it put him directly into the orbit of James Joyce.
Exactly.
We know Joyce became a major inspiration, and this was facilitated by Beckett's friend, the poet Thomas McGreevy. What was the nature of this mentorship? It seems like it went beyond just a mere acquaintance.
It was almost an apprenticeship. Beckett assisted Joyce directly, doing research for that colossal undertaking that would eventually become Finnegan's Wake.
Right.
So Joyce's revolutionary approach to language, his maximalism, the idea that you could contain the entire universe within a single sentence, that profoundly shaped Beckett's initial literary goals.
And his first publication reflects this influence directly.
It does. The 1929 critical essay, Dante, Bruno, Vico, Joyce. It was just this forceful defense of Joyce's dense, complex methods against the charge that his work was, obscure or unintelligible. Beckett championed that complexity.
He was all in on that project.
He was fully immersed in that high modernist project. He even won a literary prize in 1930 for his poem Horoscope, which was this quick exercise based on a biography of René Descartes he happened to be reading at the time. He was just showing off his ability to absorb and manipulate high-level intellectual material with dazzling speed.
But the relationship with Joyce cooled, and the sources attribute this to a very human, very personal detail.
Yes, Beckett rejected the advances of Joyce's daughter, Lucia.
And that rejection was a break, wasn't it? Not just personally, but symbolically. It sort of marked the start of Beckett finding his own literary path, one that would diverge dramatically from the Joycean direction of adding and knowing everything.
This is a great way to put it.
He briefly returned to academia, taking a lecturer position at Trinity in 1930, but it didn't last long. He resigned in 1931.
Right, and he critiqued the environment in his poem Gnome, which speaks of turning away from the loudishness of learning. It seems like any kind of formal structure chafed at him pretty quickly.
So he was looking for something deeper.
He was seeking a deeper intellectual framework for his art, and this led him directly to his first critical study, Proust, published in 1931. And you have to read this text because it is absolutely vital. It reveals the true philosophical foundation of his later work.
Specifically, the heavy influence of Arthur Schopenhauer.
Yes.
Okay, can we pause on Schopenhauer?
Mm-hmm.
Because his specific brand of 19th century German pessimism is what truly shapes the landscape of Beckett's world.
Absolutely. For Schopenhauer, human will is fundamentally irrational. It's this relentless, blind force driving us toward desires we can never satisfy.
So life is just suffering.
Life, therefore, is essentially suffering, punctuated only by temporary moments of relief. When Beckett wrote about Proust, he latched onto this idea that happiness is impossible because, when we achieve a desire, we're instantly subject to boredom, and if we don't achieve it, we suffer from want.
So the human condition isn't about progress or joy. It's defined by perpetual suffering, disappointment, and the impossibility of true satisfaction.
Yes.
That sounds an awful lot like Vladimir and Estragon waiting for Godot.
It is the blueprint. Schopenhauer argued the only temporary relief comes through aesthetic contemplation. So art, or more profoundly, through asceticism.
The denial of the will.
The radical denial of the will to live, which leads to quietude and a kind of negative peace. That concept of asceticism and denial is the deep, deep root of Beckett's later obsession with subtraction and lack.
And that journey inward became quite literal in the mid-1930s.
Yeah.
After his father died in 1933, Beckett experienced significant psychological distress.
He did. He underwent 2 years of psychoanalytic treatment with Dr. Wilfred Bion at the Tavistock Clinic in London.
And this psychoanalytic experience was critical.
It was. It was an intense, structured exploration of his inner life, his anxieties, the nature of self-confinement. And we see elements of this treatment process later in his writing, particularly in the structural anxiety and the repetitive, almost therapeutic interrogations that appear in Watt, and surprisingly, even in the structure of Waiting for Godot.
How so?
Well, the characters often feel trapped in a kind of therapeutic loop they just cannot escape.
That focus on the internal self, the subject grappling with itself, was clearly his primary subject matter. But even as he was delving into psychology, He kept one eye keenly focused on the external visual world.
He did. He developed a serious interest in art history, visiting Ireland's National Gallery frequently, with a specific focus on the Dutch Golden Age.
And what was it about that era?
I think it was that era's detailed, often somber domestic scenes, and its focus on ordinary objects and the subtle light of internal spaces. It just resonated with his growing aesthetic of observation.
And then he traveled.
He traveled extensively across Germany in 1936 and 1937, and he was filling notebooks with art observations, but juxtaposing those cultural achievements with something far, far darker.
Which was, of course, the rise of Nazi savagery.
Exactly. He was witnessing the intellectual and political foundations of Europe just crumbling, documenting the sheer human degradation, a political chaos that would soon turn his own life completely upside down.
So that combination of intense intellectual and psychological introspection combined with the visceral observation of real-world horror, that's what prepared him for the pivotal decade that followed.
The 1930s ended not with a literary triumph for him, but with a dramatic act of violence that marked a huge shift in his personal life.
In January 1938, having settled permanently in Paris, Beckett was walking down the street and he was stabbed in the chest.
He was attacked by a notorious local pimp named Prudent after he refused solicitations. It was a very close call, nearly fatal. And James Joyce, still sort of operating as a concerned mentor, arranged for Beckett to have a private room at the hospital.
The sources recount one of the most absurd, almost pre-scripted exchanges of his life during the preliminary hearing. Beckett, maybe seeking some kind of profound philosophical answer, asked his attacker why he did it.
And the attacker's response, it just encapsulates the very essence of the absurd. Prudent replied simply, "I do not know, sir. I apologize."
The ultimate non-motive, the ultimate non-explanation, delivered with perfect politeness.
It's incredible.
And Beckett eventually dropped the charges, partially, we're told, because he found the man likable and well-mannered.
That anecdote is pure Beckett. An act of extreme violence, an apology, and a shrug, no resolution, no justice, just a bizarre, isolated event.
But crucially, the publicity surrounding this incident brought Suzanne de Chevaux-du-Mesnil, who had known him previously, back into his orbit.
And this was the beginning of their lifelong partnership.
So with his personal life stabilized, the external world intervened with the start of World War II. Now, despite being Irish and having the easy escape route back to neutral Dublin, Beckett chose to stay in Paris.
He preferred, in his famous phrase, France at war to Ireland at peace. And this was a definitive moral choice. It demonstrates a profound political commitment that really contradicts the image of the detached philosopher.
And he didn't just stay, he acted. He joined the French resistance almost immediately after the German occupation in 1940.
Right, he was working as a courier for the Réseau Glorieux network. And we really need to underscore the danger of this work. For 2 years, he was not safe for a single moment.
The risk was constant.
Constant, delivering messages and intelligence while narrowly avoiding the Gestapo on multiple occasions. The sources emphasize that his network was highly effective, but it was also constantly vulnerable to betrayal.
And betrayal did come. In August 1942, his entire network was exposed, forcing Beckett and Suzanne to flee Paris south on foot.
They ultimately found refuge in the small village of Rousson in Vaucluse, where they lived in hiding for the rest of the war.
And even while in Rousson, he continued to contribute, didn't he?
He did, indirectly assisting the local Maquis, the rural resistance, with sabotage operations against the German forces. This wasn't just hiding, it was active, sustained contribution to the war effort.
After the war ended, the French government recognized this commitment, awarding him both the Croix de Guerre and the Resistance Medal. Yet this is where we see that contradiction surface again.
When asked about this period later in life, Beckett was famously dismissive. He consistently downplayed his own heroism, referring to his wartime work merely as Boy Scout stuff.
So he just redirected all the attention away from the explicit outward heroism toward the internal struggle of his art.
It's almost as if he viewed the physical danger of the war as less significant than the intellectual struggle he waged daily with language and meaning.
That's precisely the shift.
And while he was in hiding in Rousselon, he completed the novel What in 1945. This novel is structurally fascinating because even amidst the chaos of war, his mind was focused on this austere, calculated intellectual observation.
So the book uses what? Mathematical permutation?
Yes, to analyze and categorize human movement and behavior, reducing the world to these quantifiable patterns.
But the true hinge moment for his artistic career, the revelation that changed his trajectory completely, that happened just after the war.
In 1945, during a brief post-war visit back to Dublin, Beckett had a revelation while sitting in his mother's room.
And this is the moment where the intellectual foundations of his entire future career just crystallized.
It is. He realized that his former mentor, James Joyce, had taken the path of knowing more, of encyclopedic addition, of mastering the complexity of language and history.
And Beckett realized his path lay in the precise opposite direction.
Yes. His future literary direction lay in, and this is his phrase, impoverishment, in lack of knowledge, and in taking away and subtracting rather than in adding.
Wow.
It was a conscious, painful rejection of the very erudition he had spent his entire youth mastering.
That is the ultimate radical decision for a writer. Rejecting the path of adding more material, more references, more style, and instead focusing purely on poverty, failure, exile, and loss.
He would focus on man as the non-knower.
But if you look at the structure of his work, it doesn't look simpler. It often looks incredibly dense. So how does impoverishment lead to complexity?
That's where the nuance lies. The subtraction is of certainties and comforts of plot, of traditional character, of resolution. But that subtraction creates an intellectual void that the reader or the audience must confront.
So the complexity isn't in what he puts in.
No, it's in the relentless focus on the minimal material that remains. It's the difficulty of staring at nothing.
We see that moment of revelation fictionalized later in his 1958 Prax Last Tape. The character Crab fast-forwards past the precise moment of revelation on an old tape recording so the audience doesn't even get to hear it.
But Beckett later told his biographer that the missing words, the secret to his artistic direction, were precious ally. He realized that the dark, the unknowing, the limitation, the failure, these things were his most valuable artistic weapons.
A precious ally in the darkness. That's a staggering insight into his internal artistic economy. And this new direction led directly to his language decision.
Yes, he began writing his first major long works, starting with Mercier et Camier in 1946 in French.
And his justification for the shift perfectly embodies this philosophy of subtraction. He chose French, a language he knew intimately but was not his native tongue, because it allowed him to write, in his words, without style.
Right.
Wait, how does using a non-native language strip away style? Surely that adds complication.
It adds technical difficulty, but it enforces a devastating simplicity. In English, Beckett had this expansive, almost Joycean vocabulary at his fingertips. He could craft these Baroque, erudite sentences.
But French acted as a restraint.
Exactly. It forced him into simpler syntax, less ornate vocabulary, and a more direct, austere expression. It facilitated the minimalism he was looking for. It was a self-imposed limitation designed to prevent the intellectual cleverness he was trying to abandon.
So, with this path of subtraction now defined, the next phase sees this explosive creation of the work that would define his life and, really, modern theater, when it's all Godot, written between 1948 and 1949.
And the creation and success of Godot wasn't just Beckett's solo flight. The sources really emphasized the critical role of Suzanne Deschavaux du Mesnil. She was his tireless agent, securing the director, Roger Blin, who understood the play's unique rhythm and its bleak humor.
And that guaranteed its eventual successful premiere in Paris in 1953.
It did. The play became an immediate sensation. It was critically acclaimed, widely popular, and deeply controversial.
Right. Why was the audience so divided? What about the play's content drove that controversy?
Well, the controversy stemmed from its radical structure. The play just defied all theatrical expectations of the time. There was no plot development in the traditional sense, no character backstory, and zero resolution.
Vladimir and Estragon just wait.
They simply wait, and they fill the time with fragmented dialogue, games, non sequiturs. When the play premiered, the critic Vivian Mercier famously captured its essence.
What did he say?
He said Beckett achieved a theoretical impossibility, a play in which nothing happens that yet keeps audiences glued to their seats. Twice.
That line, a play in which nothing happens that yet keeps audiences glued to their seats, it summarizes the profound boredom and the profound tension of the play. And the character's uncertainty about Godot's identity is key. He could be anything. God, death, hope, a political solution.
Yes. The identity of Godot is explicitly uncertain and constantly deferred. The sources suggest that if Beckett had known who Godot was, he would have said so in the play.
So the ambiguity is the point.
The ambiguity forces the audience to confront their own expectations of meaning and narrative structure. That uncertainty, that void, is what makes the waiting a universal experience, moving it far beyond a simple narrative of two tramps.
And legacy is just immense. In 1998, Godot was voted the most significant English-language play of the 20th century by the Royal National Theatre, a truly astonishing status for a play about perpetual deferral.
And this success immediately positioned Beckett as a central figure in what critic Martin Esslin later termed the theater of the absurd. But this requires some clarification because that term is often confused with philosophical existentialism.
Okay, how should we define that distinction for the listener? We've already established Beckett was not, strictly speaking, an existentialist.
Right. So while his plays share themes with existentialism despair, survival in an incomprehensible world, existentialism often stresses the freedom and the responsibility of the individual to create meaning in a meaningless world.
Whereas Beckett's characters,
His characters often seem paralyzed. They don't choose, they simply endure. Their will is minimal.
so Beckett is closer to Albert Camus's concept of the absurd,
Hmm.
that recognition that there is an irreconcilable conflict between our innate human need for rational meaning and the universe's cold, rational indifference to that need.
Precisely. The only choice is rebellion through recognition. The protagonists of his major plays from this period, like Fin de Partie, Endgame in 1957, and Happy Days in 1961, they're trapped in situations that make proactive meaning creation nearly impossible. They struggle not to find meaning, but merely to survive the next moment.
Endgame is particularly bleak. You have characters trapped in a single room, looking out at a devastated world.
It's the ultimate statement of confinement. Ham, the blind, paralyzed patriarch, and Clove, his servant, are stuck in this routine. And the secondary characters, Nell and Nag, are literally trapped in ash bins.
And the humor in Beckett is always rooted in this hopelessness.
Always. As Nell says from inside her bin, nothing is funnier than unhappiness, I grant you that. We laugh with a will in the beginning, but it's always the same thing. The repetitive nature of suffering is the central joke.
So while the theatrical world was grappling with Godot, Beckett was also producing his outstanding prose achievements of this middle period. The trilogy of novels, Molloy, 1951, Malone Dies, 1951, and The Unnameable, 1953.
And this is where that path of subtraction is structurally clearest. The trilogy is a masterclass in progressive austerity. It's essential to trace that downward spiral of convention.
So Molloy still has some traditional elements.
Molloy still retains elements of traditional narrative. It even takes on the structure of a quest or a detective novel in the first half, though the character's memory is unreliable and his mobility is failing.
Then you move to Malone Dies.
And that's a significant step further. Malone is confined to a bed, waiting to die, and the plot, such as it is, revolves around his attempts to tell stories to fill the time. It dispenses almost entirely with external action.
It becomes a pure internal monologue.
Pure internal monologue. Though he still occasionally references place and time, the physical world is just fading.
And then the final frontier, the unnameable.
The unnameable abolishes conventional structure completely. There is no place, no time, no definitive body, just an identity or the remnants of one grappling with the compulsion to speak.
It's a terrifying stream of self-interrogation and ontological confusion.
It is the purest expression of the non-knower struggling to articulate itself.
And if the idea is to continue existing through speech, what is the ultimate conclusion of that struggle?
Despite the radical pessimism, the trilogy culminates in this fierce insistence on perseverance. The sheer linguistic effort is an act of defiance. The novel closes with that iconic phrase which just sums up the internal conflict and the relentless human will.
You must go on, I can't go on, I'll go on.
Exactly. It is the failure to stop that defines the victory.
This radical reduction continued, reaching an endpoint with the novel Commencer, How It Is, in 1961, which marks the end of this incredibly fertile middle period.
How It Is structurally severe. It pushes that concept of writing without style to its absolute limit. The sources describe it as recounting the narrator crawling through mud while dragging a sack of canned food.
And critically, it's written unpunctuated paragraphs.
Right, often using a kind of clipped, staccato, telegraphic style. It's brutalist prose. It strips away every single grammatical comfort the reader relies upon.
It's a literal representation of survival stripped to its most essential, dirty, difficult terms. Carrying that intellectual load forward, let's inject a piece of biographical absurdity. While he was crafting these masterpieces of profound despair, Beckett was also engaged in an unexpected, very human activity in the Paris suburbs in the 1950s.
Yes, the sources confirm he would often use his car to drive local children to school near his home.
And one of those children whom he drove regularly was André Roussimoff,
who, of course, would grow up to be the legendary professional wrestler André the Giant.
It's an almost unbelievable pairing. The small, austere Nobel laureate bonding with a future, 8-foot-tall wrestler?
It's incredible.
And what was the great topic of conversation between the voice of modern destitution and the eighth wonder of the world?
Cricket. Rusumov later recalled that their shared love of cricket was practically the only thing they ever discussed.
Of course it was.
It reflects the enduring appeal of that seemingly incongruous passion from Beckett's youth. It's just a perfect moment of lightness in a life often dominated by darkness.
So following the massive creative burst of the 1950s, Beckett's later period from the 60s to the 80s shifted focus again. If the middle period was about the subtraction of convention,
This final era was about the extreme distillation of form, leading to intense compactness.
the word compaction is perfect.
He was relentlessly pursuing what he called the minimal form. His dramatic works became surgical, reducing set, character, and duration to their bare necessities.
Okay, can you give us some of the most striking dramatic examples of this austerity?
And certainly. Take Breath from 1969. It is the ultimate extreme. The entire play lasts only 35 seconds.
35 seconds.
35 seconds. There are no characters, just an opening sound of a breath, an increase in light and rubbish on the stage, the sound of an intake of breath, and then blackout. It is theater reduced to a momentary existence, a sound, and a visual.
That is just...
Then you consider Play from 1962, where the human element is literally confined. 3 characters are immersed up to their necks in large funeral urns, their faces spotlit, delivering this overlapping, fragmented dialogue about a love triangle.
So they're physically trapped, which reinforces the thematic entrapment.
Completely. And perhaps the most famous example of this human reduction is Not I from 1972.
Not I is almost pure light and sound. The staging consists almost solely of, in Beckett's chilling description, a moving mouth with the rest of the stage in darkness.
The action is focused entirely on the frantic, involuntary rush of speech from this single, isolated orifice, a character trying to articulate a trauma that is not yet fully hers or perhaps cannot be owned.
The thematic focus tightens significantly during this period, concentrating almost exclusively on memory, forced recollection, the self-confined, and the act of being observed.
Yes, the struggle is no longer about waiting for external salvation, but about the difficulty of maintaining a coherent self in the face of vanishing time and memory.
But despite his reputation for abstraction and internal focus, we do see Beckett engage in relatively explicit political commentary during this late phase.
That's surprising to many, yes.
Which work demonstrates this?
The 1982 play Catastrophe, which he dedicated to the Czech dissident and playwright Václav Havel. This play deals quite explicitly with the idea of dictatorship and control. A director figure manipulates a protagonist, a sibyl, until he is perfectly compliant and submissive. It's a raw, concentrated look at the totalitarian impulse.
So a rare outward political statement from a writer, often criticized for ignoring external societal issues.
A very rare one.
As he pursued these compressed dramatic forms, he also dedicated significant energy to transdisciplinary experimentation, working across various artistic mediums.
Radio, television, and cinema, like his 1965 film starring Buster Keaton.
His TV plays are particularly illuminating, aren't they? Because they reveal his deep engagement with other arts.
They do. Works like Ghost Trio from 77 and Nachtenträume from 83 use classical music excerpts from Beethoven and Schubert, respectively, to structure the text, giving them this formal, almost musical precision.
And how does that musical structure manifest in the plays?
It creates a rhythmic repetition and variation, almost like a theme and variation in a sonata. The visual cues often mirror images from art history, evoking themes of longing, suffering, and ambiguity.
So he was creating these dense, beautiful, and difficult visual poems designed for the small screen.
Exactly. He was using the camera not to capture realism, but to sculpt light and shadow, much like the Dutch masters he studied in his youth.
And he also wrote what was essentially an opera. Neither in 1977, working with the composer Morton Feldman, this relentless drive to push the boundary of form is really the definition of his late decades.
In terms of prose, the late period saw a renaissance with short, intensely focused novellas, sometimes collected as Know-How On.
Company, 1980, Ill Said, 1982, and Worst Word Ho, 1983.
These pieces continue his preoccupation with the self-confined and observed. For instance, the opening of Company just sets the stage instantly. A voice comes to one in the dark. Imagine.
So the narrative becomes intensely focused on the verifiable physical reality of the body and the mind, grappling with isolation.
And this focus became acutely personal in his final work. His very last written piece, composed in 1988 while he was in the hospital in a nursing home, was the poem, What is the Word?
It's a heartbreaking final statement. A writer whose entire life was dedicated to finding the perfect word ends by grappling explicitly with the failure of language itself.
It reflects his lifelong artistic struggle, amplified by sickness and encroaching mortality. The poem is just a series of stammering attempts to find the term, the word that can articulate the inexpressible state of being.
To understand these challenging late works, we really have to talk about his supreme interpreters, the actors he wrote specifically for and worked with so intimately.
He was famously protective of his text, but deeply collaborative with those he trusted.
Like Jack McGarren.
Jack McGarren was one such key figure. He was instrumental in bringing Beckett's prose and drama together, being the first actor to create a successful one-man show, beginning to end, drawing from the entire Beckett canon.
And Beckett wrote for him specifically.
Yes, he saw McGarren's talent and wrote radio plays like Embers and the teleplay, Fidjo, specifically tailored to his abilities in those respective mediums.
But his most famous collaborator, his ultimate muse, was the actress Billie Whitelaw.
Absolutely. Their professional relationship spanned 25 years, with Beckett creating many of his most demanding, experimental, and physically constrained pieces like Not I, Footfalls, and Rockabye, specifically for her.
Whitelaw described their first meeting as trust at first sight.
She committed totally to his process. She said, Sam knew that I would turn myself inside out to give him what he wanted. She was willing to become an object, a mouth, a purely rhythmic element in his theatrical experiments.
There's a wonderful story about him directing her in Happy Days, where she is trapped up to her waist in a mound of earth. She asked him for direction on where she should look during a particular monologue.
And Beckett paused, reflected on her question, and then gave her the one-word reply that distills his entire philosophy: inward.
That direction is everything. It wasn't about the audience or the set or the external world. It was about the internal truth of the struggle.
And Whitelaw was uniquely equipped to embody that. She offered this remarkably evocative description of performing Footfalls, the play where she must pace back and forth in a measured rhythm.
What did she say?
She described the experience as feeling like a moving, musical Edvard Munch painting. Just shows how Beckett demanded his performers embody not traditional characters, but psychological and aesthetic states.
We should also recognize the crucial role of stage designer Jocelyn Herbert.
A close friend. Beckett relied on her to realize his aesthetic of minimalism, praising her for her sensitivity and her ability to avoid the tendency among designers to overstate. Even the visual landscape had to adhere to that principle of subtraction.
So, the pinnacle of his public life, the moment that officially cemented his status as a titan, came in 1969 with the Nobel Prize in Literature.
And again, the citation perfectly captured the contradiction, honoring him for his writing, which, in new forms for the novel and drama, in the destitution of modern man, acquires its elevation.
But for Beckett and his inner circle, this recognition was met with profound distress. His partner Suzanne famously called the award a catastrophe.
She knew that this intense global spotlight would inevitably shatter the intensely private, hermetic life that Beckett had so carefully constructed around his work.
It's the ultimate recognition of success for a man whose entire artistic philosophy centered on failure. How did he handle the sudden deluge of fame and attention? Did he withdraw completely?
He remained fiercely private and notoriously disliked public ceremonies. He did not attend the Nobel ceremony. However, the sources note that he was often surprisingly amiable with those who sought him out. He would meet scholars and sincere admirers in the anonymous, neutral space of the lobby of the Hotel PLM Saint-Jacques in Paris, near his Montparnasse home, where he could engage on his own terms.
That need for anonymity, for a neutral space, is entirely consistent with his art. And when his work emerged in the 1950s, it immediately polarized critics, which is, the hallmark of genuinely revolutionary art.
The division was foundational. Philosophical critics like Jean-Paul Sartre and Theodore Adorno embraced Beckett's work. They praised him precisely because he exposed the absurdity of the human condition and critically refused the false simplicities offered by conventional morality or narrative.
They saw his refusal of resolution as a brave confrontation with modern reality.
Exactly. But there were equally powerful voices on the other side who saw his work as a betrayal of art's social mission.
Yes, the Marxist critics, notably George Lukács, who condemned Beckett for what they saw as a decadent lack of realism.
For them, true art must reflect society and advocate for change. Beckett's retreat into internal monologue and destitution, they argued, was a harmful avoidance of social responsibility. And this critical divide art as a social mirror versus art as psychological exploration is one of his most significant legacies.
And he decisively chose the latter. His influence has since permeated nearly every artistic discipline.
His sustained attack on the realist tradition opened up vast new possibilities. We see his influence not just in fellow playwrights like Harold Pinter and Tom Stoppard, or novelists like Jane Coetzee and John Fosse.
But also composers.
Right, composers like Philip Glass and Morton Feldman were directly inspired by his use of repetition and minimalist structure.
And you can trace this legacy right up to contemporary filmmaking. How does Beckett's attack on realism enable a film by, say, Charlie Kaufman?
Kaufman's work, particularly films like Synecdoche, New York, or I'm Thinking of Ending Things, fundamentally disrupts expectations of plot, time, and identity. This is pure Beckettian influence. By demonstrating that high art could dispense with linear causality, realistic dialogue, and coherent selfhood, Beckett provided the foundational permission structure for artists to explore internal reality and fragmentation rather than external mimesis.
On the practical side of his legacy, there's the controversial issue of posthumous control. His work is famously difficult to stage without conflict today.
That control is maintained by the Beckett estate, currently managed by his nephew, Edward Beckett. They exert firm control over performance rights, insisting that productions adhere strictly to the original stage directions.
Including timing, movement, and set design.
Everything.
But why such rigid control over a body of work that celebrates the absurd and the chaotic?
It's rooted in the idea of preserving the intentionality behind the minimalism. For Beckett, timing and placement were crucial, rhythmic elements, not arbitrary suggestions.
So deviating from those instructions, say, changing the color of a set, or altering the pause length risks, reintroducing the overstatement, and sentimentalization he spent his life subtracting.
It's the ultimate protection of his minimalist vision.
When Beckett died in December 1989, he was interred with Suzanne in the Cimetière du Montparnasse in Paris. And even his final resting place adheres to his aesthetic of neutrality.
His gravestone is a simple granite slab that, following his directive, is any color so long as it's gray.
An instruction that just encapsulates the man's preference for the anonymous, the nondescript, the purely functional.
His honors are substantial, of course, including the Croix de Guerre and the Prix International, and his connection to Dublin is permanently enshrined in the city's landscape.
The spectacular Samuel Beckett Bridge, designed by Santiago Calatrava, opened in 2009. It's shaped like a harp lying on its side, and it stands upstream from the James Joyce Bridge.
A fitting physical representation of the two great, opposing, yet related titans of Irish modernism.
He's also honored by the Irish Naval Service ship Le Samuel Beckett.
And his archives are scattered globally at the Harry Ransom Center, Washington University, and Trinity College, Dublin, a final testament to the global reach of a writer who devoted his life to studying the confined, isolated self.
So this deep dive really reveals a man of profound contradictions. A celebrated athlete and intellectual who chose the path of failure and lack of knowledge.
A wartime hero who dismissed his own valor. A revolutionary voice who sought quietude. He achieved transforming influence and ultimate recognition precisely because he stripped literature back to its absolute essentials.
He fundamentally redefined what art could be by focusing on the irreducible struggle of the human condition. The perseverance in the face of silence.
And we return to that contradiction we noted earlier. He referred to his French resistance heroism, the explicit life-or-death battles he fought against occupation, as merely Boy Scout stuff.
You dismiss the external.
He preferred to focus on the internal, lifelong struggle to express the inexpressible.
And this raises the essential, provocative question for you to consider. If Beckett saw the physical heroism as trivial, does the true measure of his life lie not in the explicit battles he won in the outer world, but in the internal, arduous artistic struggle he maintained until the very end? The struggle to articulate the nothingness at the core of human experience.
What is the word? That's something that the world and you, the listener, must continue exploring. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the world of Samuel Beckett.